It was the summer of 1944, and in the German trenches along Normandy, veteran Wehrmacht soldiers shared stories about American tanks with a mixture of arrogance and contempt. They had faced the Shermans in Italy, in North Africa, and now in France. To them, the M4 Sherman medium tank was little more than a joke on tracks. Führerzug, lighter, was what German soldiers mockingly called the Sherman. A single shot from a Panzer IV, Tiger, or Panther, and the Sherman would burst into flames, consuming its crew in seconds. The numbers seemed to prove the Germans right. A Tiger could destroy 5, 6, even 10 Shermans before being neutralized. German armor was superior, their cannons more powerful, their engineering more refined. But there was something the German soldiers, in their confidence, didn't fully comprehend. Something that would irreversibly change the course of the war. It wasn't just about individual quality or technical superiority. It was about something far more fundamental, the crushing power of American industrial production. To understand how the Sherman transformed World War II, we need to go back to the dark days of 1940. Europe was in flames. France had fallen in mere 6 weeks before the German Blitzkrieg. Britain fought alone against the Third Reich. And the United States watched, technically neutral, but deeply concerned. The United States Army had a serious problem. Its tanks were obsolete and insufficient. The M3 Stuart light tank was inadequate for heavy combat. The M3 Lee medium tank was an emergency design with serious flaws, including a hull-mounted main gun that severely limited its combat effectiveness. In April 1941, the Aberdeen Proving Ground received a directive that would change armored warfare history, develop a new medium tank that could be mass-produced, reliable, and effective against German armor. The design team, led by talented engineers at the Detroit Arsenal, worked around the clock. The result was revolutionary in its pragmatism. The M4 Sherman wasn't trying to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be the most effective tank that American industry could produce in massive numbers. It featured a fully rotating turret with a 75mm main gun, welded or cast hull construction, sloped armor for improved protection, and most importantly, a design that could be manufactured quickly and maintained easily in field conditions. The first pilot model rolled off the production line in September 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor would bring America fully into the war. Nobody knew it yet, but this tank would become one of the most produced armored vehicles in history, with over 49,000 units manufactured by war's end. The Sherman's first real test came in North Africa in late 1942, during Operation Torch. British forces had already been using American-supplied M3 Lees and Grants, and they were desperately awaiting something better. The Sherman arrived just in time. At the Battle of El Alamein, British Shermans equipped with a standard 75mm gun faced Rommel's Afrika Korps. The results were mixed. Against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs, the Sherman performed admirably. Its reliability in the desert conditions was exceptional, something that couldn't be said for many British tanks that constantly broke down in the sand and heat. But German tank commanders quickly learned the Sherman's weaknesses. The 75mm gun, while adequate, struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of newer German tanks at range. The Sherman's armor, while sloped, was relatively thin compared to German heavy tanks, and there was that terrifying tendency to catch fire when penetrated, a result of the gasoline engine and ammunition storage layout. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, a German tank commander in North Africa, later recalled, "We respected the Sherman crews for their bravery, but we did not fear their machines. One well-placed shot from our long 75mm gun, and the Sherman would brew up. We called it the Tommy Cooker when the British used them." Yet despite these disadvantages, the Shermans kept coming. For every one destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Germans won many tactical engagements, but they were losing the strategic war of attrition. They simply couldn't replace their losses at the rate the Allies could. The invasion of Italy in 1943 presented new challenges for the Sherman. The mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and heavily defended positions favored the defender. German forces, fighting a masterful withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, used every advantage they had. At Salerno, Anzio, and Monte Cassino, Sherman crews learned brutal lessons. The confined terrain meant they often faced German tanks and anti-tank guns at close range, where the enemy's superior firepower was devastating. The infamous German 88mm anti-aircraft gun, used in an anti-tank role, could destroy a Sherman at over 2,000 yards, far beyond the effective range of the Sherman's 75mm gun. American tank crews developed new tactics out of necessity. They learned to work closely with infantry, to use terrain for cover, to attack in coordinated groups rather than single tanks. The doctrine emerged: never send a Sherman alone against a German heavy tank. Use 5 Shermans, attack from multiple angles, keep moving, and overwhelm the enemy with numbers and speed. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, one of America's top tank aces, described the Italian campaign. "We knew we weren't in the best tank. Every man in my crew knew that if we went toe-to-toe with a Tiger, we'd probably lose. But we also knew that we were faster, more reliable, and there were a hell of a lot more of us than there were of them. We learned to use those advantages." The Sherman also showed its versatility in Italy. Engineers modified Shermans for various specialized roles: mine-clearing flails, bulldozer blades for obstacle removal, and even flamethrower versions for attacking fortified positions. This adaptability would become one of the Sherman's greatest strengths. While Sherman crews fought and died in North Africa and Italy, something extraordinary was happening back in the United States. American industry had transformed itself into the greatest military production machine the world had ever seen. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. At the peak of production in 1943, American factories were producing Shermans at a rate of over 2,000 per month. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, Ford's plant in Michigan, Pacific Car and Foundry, Pressed Steel Car Company, and numerous other facilities ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Henry J. Kaiser, the shipbuilding magnate, applied assembly line techniques to tank production with revolutionary results. What had taken weeks to produce now took days. Standardized parts meant that Shermans built in different factories were interchangeable. A damaged Sherman could be repaired using parts from any other Sherman, regardless of where it was manufactured. Compare this to German production. The vaunted Tiger tank, superior in almost every technical aspect, was produced in numbers of only about 1,350 over the entire war. The Panther, Germany's main battle tank from 1943 onwards, saw about 6,000 units produced. These were extraordinary machines, but they were complex, expensive, and time-consuming to build. A Tiger tank required over 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman required fewer than 10,000. A Tiger cost roughly 10 times more than a Sherman. And while a Tiger might defeat 5 Shermans in combat, the Americans could replace those 5 Shermans in the time it took Germany to build 1 Tiger. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps the most respected tank commander of the war, understood this reality. He reportedly said, "The Americans' mass production is their true weapon. Quality doesn't matter when quantity can be deployed so rapidly. We destroy 10 tanks, and 15 more appear the next day." June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. Among the first armored vehicles to hit the beaches of Normandy were specially modified Shermans, the duplex drive, or DD Shermans, equipped with flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore. Many of these swimming Shermans were swamped and sank in the rough seas, taking their crews with them, but enough made it ashore to provide crucial fire support for the infantry struggling to establish a beachhead. Within hours, regular Shermans were being unloaded directly onto the beaches, despite German artillery and the chaos of battle. The bocage country of Normandy presented unexpected challenges. The ancient hedgerows, thick earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, created a defender's paradise. German forces used these natural fortifications to ambush Allied armor with devastating effectiveness. Shermans advancing down narrow country lanes found themselves trapped, unable to maneuver, facing Panther and Tiger tanks or deadly anti-tank guns positioned in the hedgerows. The close-range engagements negated the Sherman's mobility advantage, and its armor inferiority became painfully apparent. German tank ace Michael Wittmann demonstrated this on June 13, 1944, at Villers-Bocage. In less than 15 minutes, his single Tiger tank destroyed approximately 14 tanks and 15 personnel carriers of the British 7th Armoured Division, many of them Shermans. It seemed to confirm every German prejudice about Allied tank inferiority. But American ingenuity responded. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, an ordinary tanker, developed a simple device made from German beach obstacles. Steel prongs welded to the front of a Sherman that allowed it to cut through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. These Rhino, or Cullen hedgerow cutters, were rapidly manufactured and fitted to hundreds of Shermans. Suddenly, Shermans could burst through hedgerows at unexpected points, outflanking German positions. The tactical balance shifted, and all the while, more Shermans arrived from the beaches every day, while German reinforcements were pounded by Allied air power and struggled to reach the front. The Sherman wasn't a static design. As the war progressed and its limitations became apparent, the Allies continuously improved it. This adaptability was itself a crucial advantage. German tanks, especially late-war designs, were so complex that modifications were difficult and time-consuming. The most significant upgrade was the 76 mm gun, introduced in 1944. This longer, higher-velocity cannon could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at reasonable combat ranges and posed a serious threat even to Tigers. The Sherman Firefly, a British modification mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun, was even more deadly. American crews initially resisted the 76 mm Shermans, preferring the 75 mm version. Why? The 76 mm gun had less effective high-explosive ammunition for supporting infantry and destroying fortifications. This reveals an important truth. Most of a Sherman's work wasn't fighting other tanks. It was supporting infantry, destroying machine gun nests, reducing fortifications, and providing mobile firepower. By late 1944, approximately 20% of American Shermans in Europe carried the 76 mm gun. This provided a good balance, enough firepower to deal with German armor when necessary, while maintaining the infantry support capability that was the Sherman's primary role. The British went even further. The Sherman Firefly, with its 17-pounder gun, could destroy any German tank it encountered. British doctrine typically assigned one Firefly to every troop of 4 Shermans. German tank commanders learned to fear the Firefly and tried to identify and destroy them first, which is why many Firefly crews painted over the distinctive muzzle brake to disguise their tanks. Other modifications included improved armor through applique plates and sandbags, better ammunition storage to reduce fires, upgraded engines for more power, improved suspension for better mobility, and wet ammunition stowage that dramatically reduced the fire risk when penetrated. The Sherman became a platform for innovation, spawning dozens of variants: tank destroyers, recovery vehicles, artillery pieces, rocket launchers, bridge layers, mine clearers, and amphibious versions. This versatility meant that Sherman production facilities and supply chains could support an entire ecosystem of armored vehicles. August 1944. The Normandy campaign was reaching its climax. German forces, having defended tenaciously for 2 months, suddenly found themselves in danger of complete encirclement. The Allied breakout from the Bocage country had succeeded, and now American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces were closing a massive pocket around the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army near the town of Falaise. Inside the pocket, German forces were trapped. Approximately 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks and vehicles, artillery and supplies. The roads became congested with German units desperately trying to escape before the pocket closed completely. This was the moment when the Sherman's true strategic value became undeniable. Allied armored divisions, spearheaded by hundreds of Shermans, raced to close the gap. German forces tried to break out, throwing their remaining Tiger and Panther tanks against the Allied lines. In the resulting chaos, individual tank duels mattered less than the ability to sustain continuous operations. Shermans that were damaged could be quickly repaired or replaced. Allied supply lines, protected by air superiority, kept the tanks fueled and armed. German tanks, even when they broke through locally, had nowhere to go and no fuel to get there. The Falaise pocket became a killing ground. Allied aircraft and artillery pounded the trapped Germans mercilessly. Shermans, working in coordinated groups, systematically destroyed German armor attempting to escape. The roads became littered with destroyed vehicles, German and Allied alike, but the Germans couldn't replace their losses. When the pocket finally collapsed, the Germans had lost the equivalent of an entire field army. Thousands of vehicles, including most of their remaining armor in France, were destroyed or captured. The Wehrmacht in the West was shattered as an effective fighting force. A German officer captured at Falaise later reflected, "We destroyed many of their tanks, yes. But they always had more. Always. We could win every battle and still lose the war." And that is exactly what happened. After Falaise, the character of the war in Western Europe changed dramatically. With German forces in disarray, Allied armor raced across France faster than the German retreat in 1940. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. By early September, Allied forces had advanced more than 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. This rapid advance showcased the Sherman's greatest strengths: reliability and maintainability. German tanks, even the superior Panthers and Tigers, frequently broke down during retreats. Their complex transmissions, overworked engines, and fuel consumption made sustained high-speed movement difficult. Shermans, by contrast, could maintain operational tempo for days or even weeks with minimal maintenance. Their relatively simple mechanical design meant that crew members could perform many repairs themselves. The widespread availability of spare parts meant that even seriously damaged Shermans could often be returned to service quickly. The pursuit also revealed the danger of overconfidence. Allied commanders, flush with victory, began to believe that the war might be over by Christmas 1944. Supplies, especially fuel, were stretched thin as armored divisions outran their logistics. This set the stage for disappointment when German resistance stiffened at the German border. But the advance had accomplished something crucial. It had destroyed Germany's ability to conduct mobile warfare in the West. The loss of vehicles and fuel meant that even when German forces stabilized the front, they lacked the mobility to conduct effective counterattacks. The Sherman divisions had freedom of movement that their German counterparts could only dream of. September 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed an audacious plan, Operation Market Garden. Airborne forces would seize bridges across the major rivers of the Netherlands, creating a corridor through which Allied armor, including the British XXX Corps with its Shermans, would race to outflank German defenses and potentially end the war in 1944. It was a disaster. The single narrow road became congested with vehicles. German resistance was far stronger than expected. The corridor became known as Hell's Highway, as German forces attacked the extended column from both sides. The Shermans, confined to the road, couldn't maneuver effectively. The operation culminated at Arnhem, where British paratroopers were surrounded and destroyed because the armoured relief force couldn't break through in time. Market Garden failed, and with it died hopes of ending the war quickly. The operation demonstrated the Sherman's limitations in constrained terrain against determined defenders. It also showed that no amount of technological superiority or numbers could overcome poor planning and intelligence failures. The war would continue into 1945. December 16, 1944. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, Germany launched its last great offensive in the West. Over 200,000 German troops, spearheaded by some 600 tanks and assault guns, attacked thinly held American lines. Adolf Hitler was gambling everything on a breakthrough to the port of Antwerp that might split the Allied armies and force negotiations. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise. American units, including Sherman tank battalions, were overrun or surrounded. In the confusion, German armored spearheads penetrated deep into Allied lines. The weather was terrible. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft and gave German armor a chance to operate without air attack. 4 German tank crews. This was their moment. Panthers and Tigers, supported by Panzer IVs and assault guns, tore through American positions. At places like Krinkel-Trocherath, German armor overwhelmed American defenses. The Battle of the Bulge saw some of the fiercest tank combat of the war. But even in this moment of German tactical success, the strategic situation was hopeless. American forces, though surprised and sometimes surrounded, didn't break. At the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne, American defenders held out despite being completely encircled. The Germans lacked the fuel to sustain their offensive. Their plan had relied on capturing American fuel depots, which the Americans successfully denied them. And then the Shermans arrived. As the weather cleared, Allied air power devastated German columns caught in the open. American reinforcements, including entire armored divisions with hundreds of Shermans, were rushed to the Ardennes from across Europe. The Germans found themselves facing the same situation they had inflicted so many times: overwhelming numbers of enemy armor that they couldn't match or replace. The Battle of St. Vith saw intense tank combat as American Sherman units fought to contain German penetrations. At Celles, the German spearhead was surrounded and destroyed. At Bastogne, George Patton's Third Army, with its Sherman battalions, smashed through German lines to relieve the siege. Sergeant John Hendricks, Sherman tank commander with the 4th Armored Division, described the relief of Bastogne. "We knew the entire operation depended on us getting through. The Germans threw everything they had at us: Panthers, assault guns, anti-tank positions. We lost tanks, we lost friends, but we kept pushing. When we finally broke through to Bastogne, we knew we'd broken their offensive." By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had lost over 600 tanks and assault guns that could never be replaced, along with fuel reserves that didn't exist. The Americans had lost heavily too, but replacement tanks were already being shipped from the United States. The strategic balance was even more tilted in favor of the Allies than before the offensive. February 1945. Allied forces stood on the borders of Germany itself, preparing for the final campaign. 7 months of hard fighting since D-Day had brought them to this point. Now came the most difficult part: breaking through the prepared defences of the Siegfried Line and invading the German homeland. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, was a defensive system of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and fortified positions stretching along Germany's western border. It had been built in the 1930s, and while outdated, it was still formidable when properly manned and defended. Shermans proved crucial in breaching these defenses. Equipped with bulldozer blades, they cleared obstacles. With their 75mm and 76mm guns, they provided direct fire support against bunkers. Special assault vehicles based on the Sherman chassis cleared minefields and provided close support to infantry. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 saw one of the largest concentrations of Allied armor in the war. Shermans were ferried across the river on pontoon bridges, then fanned out into the German countryside. German resistance was increasingly desperate and disorganized. Fuel shortages meant that even operational German tanks often couldn't move. Hitler Youth soldiers armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets became a more common threat than German armor. The final months of the war saw Sherman battalions racing across Germany, covering hundreds of miles. They liberated concentration camps, captured German cities, and linked up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Sherman tanks sitting in positions from Bavaria to the Elbe River. While the European theater dominated American attention, Shermans fought effectively in other parts of the world. In the Pacific, the Sherman was vastly superior to any Japanese tank it encountered. The Japanese Type 97 Chiha medium tank was obsolete by 1941 standards, and even Japan's best tank, the Type 4 Chitu, never saw combat in significant numbers. Pacific Shermans were often fitted with additional armor and specialized equipment for jungle warfare. They supported marine and army operations across hundreds of island battlefields. At Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Shermans provided crucial fire support against Japanese fortifications. The Sherman's role in the Pacific was less about tank versus tank combat and more about being a mobile bunker buster and infantry support vehicle. Its 75mm gun could reduce Japanese pillboxes and fortified positions that were virtually impervious to small arms and even to artillery. Flamethrower Shermans, known as Zippos or Satan tanks, were particularly effective against caves and underground fortifications. The Sherman also served with British and Commonwealth forces in Burma, where it faced Japanese armor and fought in some of the world's most difficult terrain. Its reliability in tropical conditions proved superior to many British-designed tanks. Free French forces used Shermans to liberate North Africa and France. Soviet forces received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease, though Soviet tankers had mixed opinions about them compared to their own T-34s. The Sherman saw service with Canadian, Polish, and other Allied armies. Statistics and technical specifications tell only part of the Sherman's story. The real story is about the men who crewed them. 5 men lived, fought, and often died together in the cramped interior of a Sherman: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver/bow gunner. Life inside a Sherman was challenging. The interior was cramped, noisy, and uncomfortable. The smell of cordite, oil, sweat, and fear permeated everything. Visibility was limited. Buttoned up inside the tank, crews relied on periscopes and vision blocks that gave only a narrow view of the battlefield. Opening the hatches for better visibility risked death from snipers and shell fragments. Tank combat was psychologically devastating in ways that infantry combat wasn't. When a Sherman was hit and penetrated, the crew had seconds to escape before fire or ammunition explosion killed them. Tankers who survived one tank being knocked out often had to get into another Sherman and do it again. The psychological toll was immense. Sergeant James Bates, who survived the war after having 3 tanks shot out from under him, later wrote, "People think tank combat is impersonal, that we're protected by armor. They don't understand that when that armor is penetrated, we're trapped in a metal box with high explosive ammunition and gasoline all around us. I saw friends burn to death because they couldn't get out in time. I still hear their screams." But Sherman crews also developed pride in their tanks and confidence in their abilities. They learned that while their tank might be outgunned, it wasn't helpless. Good tactics, teamwork, and the knowledge that they had support and replacements gave them confidence that German tankers increasingly lacked. The crew bond was extraordinarily strong. These 5 men depended on each other absolutely. They shared food, water, exhaustion, fear, and triumph. Many Sherman crews developed such effective coordination that they could operate almost instinctively, each man knowing what the others would do without needing orders. To truly understand the Sherman's impact, we need to examine its technical characteristics in detail. The standard M4 Sherman weighed approximately 30 tons, compared to 45 tons for a Panther and 56 tons for a Tiger. This weight advantage meant the Sherman was more mobile, could cross bridges that heavier German tanks couldn't, and put less strain on its engine and transmission. The Sherman used several different engines depending on the variant. The Continental R975 radial aircraft engine was most common, but some versions used twin General Motors diesel engines, a Chrysler multibank engine, or a Ford GAA V8. This diversity was actually an advantage. It meant that production wasn't dependent on a single engine supplier. The transmission and drivetrain were relatively simple and reliable. German tanks, especially late-war designs, used complex transmissions that were engineering marvels but also maintenance nightmares. A Sherman could be driven by a soldier with minimal training. A Panther required an experienced driver and was notorious for transmission failures. The Sherman suspension used a vertical volute spring suspension (VVSS) system that was simple, reliable, and easily repaired. Later versions used horizontal volute spring suspension (HVSS) that improved ride quality and reduced ground pressure. Neither system was as sophisticated as the German torsion bar suspension, but both were far more maintainable. Armor protection was the Sherman's weakest point. The frontal armor ranged from 51 to 76 mm depending on the variant, compared to 80 to 120 mm on a Panther and up to 150 mm on a Tiger. The Sherman's sloped armor helped, but it was still vulnerable to German 75 mm and 88 mm guns at most combat ranges. The fire risk that earned the Sherman its Ronson nickname was real. Early Shermans stored ammunition in vulnerable sponson racks. When hit, the ammunition would often ignite, consuming the tank. The introduction of wet stowage, ammunition stored in water-filled jackets, in 1944 dramatically reduced this problem, but the Sherman never lost its reputation as a fire trap. The 75 mm M3 gun was adequate in 1942–43, but increasingly obsolete by 1944. It could reliably penetrate about 60 to 80 mm of armor at 500 yards, sufficient against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs, but inadequate against Panthers and Tigers. The 76 mm M1 gun introduced in 1944 could penetrate about 110 mm at 500 yards, making it competitive with German armor at typical combat ranges. Let's examine the production numbers that truly explain the Sherman's impact. By war's end, approximately 49,234 Sherman tanks had been produced by various manufacturers. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 1,350 Tiger tanks of all types. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks. Germany produced approximately 8,500 Panzer IV tanks. Soviet Union produced approximately 84,000 tanks of all types. United States produced approximately 88,000 tanks of all types, of which Shermans were the majority. But raw production numbers don't tell the whole story. We need to consider operational availability, the percentage of produced tanks that were actually combat-ready at any given time. German tanks had notoriously low operational readiness rates. A Panther battalion might have 76 tanks on paper, but only 30 to 40 operationally ready due to mechanical failures, lack of spare parts, or insufficient trained crews. By late 1944, German operational readiness for all armored vehicles was estimated at 50 to 60% at best, often much lower. American Sherman battalions typically maintained operational readiness rates of 80 to 90%. The simple, reliable design, abundant spare parts, and well-trained maintenance crews meant that Sherman stayed in the fight. A Sherman that threw a track could be back in action in hours. A Panther with transmission problems might be out of action for weeks, if spare parts were available at all. The replacement rate was equally important. A Sherman destroyed on Monday could be replaced by Thursday. A Tiger destroyed on Monday would never be replaced. Germany simply couldn't build them fast enough. By 1945, destroyed German armor was being replaced by hastily trained infantry units, while American armor was being replaced with more Shermans, often upgraded versions. Numerous myths surround the Sherman tank, and it's important to separate fact from fiction. The myth of the 5 Shermans to kill a Tiger is partially true in tactical encounters, but misleading strategically. Yes, in direct combat, Tiger tanks had impressive kill ratios against Shermans. But most Shermans never fought Tigers, and most Tigers were lost to causes other than direct combat with enemy tanks. The Ronson lighter myth, that the Sherman was nicknamed after a lighter company whose slogan was "Lights every time," is actually false. This nickname was applied retrospectively after the war. During the war, crews used terms like "brewing up" for a tank catching fire, but the specific Ronson association came later. The myth that American commanders carelessly sacrificed Sherman crews in suicidal attacks is also exaggerated. American doctrine emphasized combined arms tactics, artillery support, and air power precisely because commanders knew the Sherman's limitations. American tank crews had significantly higher survival rates than German tank crews by 1944 to 45. The myth of German technical superiority is both true and irrelevant. Yes, German tanks had better guns and armor in individual comparisons. But war isn't decided by individual vehicle comparisons. It's decided by logistics, production, maintenance, training, air power, intelligence, and dozens of other factors. In almost every category except individual tank versus tank combat, the Allies had decisive advantages. Some historians have criticized the Sherman as inadequate, arguing that the US should have developed a better tank sooner. This criticism ignores the realities of industrial production, logistics, and military doctrine. The time spent developing a supertank would have meant fewer tanks available when needed. The complex logistics of supporting multiple different tank types would have reduced overall effectiveness. The Sherman's combat service didn't end in 1945. The tank served in numerous conflicts for decades afterward, demonstrating its fundamental soundness as a design. Israel used upgraded Shermans effectively in the 1948 War of Independence, the 1956 Suez Crisis, and even in the 1967 Six-Day War. Israeli Shermans, equipped with modern 105mm guns and upgraded engines, destroyed Soviet-supplied Arab armor in several engagements. The Sherman served in the Korean War, where its reliability and firepower proved effective against North Korean T-34-85 tanks and in infantry support roles. French forces used Shermans in Indochina. British Shermans fought in Malaya. The tank appeared in conflicts on every continent. The Sherman influenced post-war tank design significantly. Its concept, a reliable, mass-producible medium tank with good mobility and adequate firepower, became the standard approach for most nations. The Soviet T-54-55, the most produced tank design in history, owed much to lessons learned from both the T-34 and captured Shermans. The Sherman also established American tank doctrine that persists today: emphasis on reliability, maintainability, and systems integration rather than simply maximizing armor and firepower. Modern American tanks like the M60 and M1 Abrams are spiritual successors to the Sherman philosophy. German soldiers mocked the Sherman, and in individual combat encounters, they often had good reason to. but they fundamentally misunderstood how the Allies were fighting the war. They saw each battle as a test of technical and tactical superiority, which they often won. They failed to see that they were losing a war of industrial and economic capacity, which they could never win. A German tank ace might destroy 10 Shermans and feel victorious. But those 10 Shermans were replaced within a week, while his own tank, when finally destroyed, was irreplaceable. The veteran crew that had accumulated hard-won experience was also irreplaceable. By 1945, Germany was sending teenagers with weeks of training into combat in tanks that had no fuel and no spare parts. The Sherman represented a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. Germany built the Tiger because German engineering culture valued technical perfection and individual superiority. America built the Sherman because American industrial culture valued reliability, mass production, and logistical sustainability. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this better than most German commanders. In 1944, he wrote, "The enemy's air superiority and the numerical superiority of his tanks and artillery are too overwhelming. We face an enemy who is inexhaustible in men and material." German General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Division, was even more blunt after the war. "We were told that our tanks were superior, and they were. But what good is superiority when you face 5 enemy tanks for every one of yours? What good is the best tank in the world when it has no fuel, no ammunition, and no spare parts?" The Germans never solved this fundamental problem. They continued producing complex, expensive, difficult-to-maintain tanks until the very end of the war. They never achieved the kind of standardization and mass production that could have given them numerical parity with the Allies. Their engineering excellence became a strategic liability.